Okay, I think this is on, and if I may, I'm to introduce our concluding panel. We've had a very wide-ranging and quite energetic discussion in the course of this day, and the purpose of this panel is to now take a look ahead. What should we be doing going forward? I think everyone on the panel has already been introduced except Gil for you. Gil Van Bockelen, who's joined us, is the CEO of Athersys Inc., and also in that capacity serves as the chair of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. We're delighted to have you with us, Gil. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks. Actually, I'm ex officio. I served as the chairman of the Alliance for about 2.5 years, and I'm still actively involved as part of the leadership team. So,
okay.
Jeff Mackay actually took over as chairman earlier this year.
Excellent. So you have that experience at least to bring to bear. Everyone else I know has participated already in the course of the day, and I'd like to begin, if I could, by reflecting all the way back to where Alta started us in the morning, saying, we're focused on quality and safety of, and she, let's avoid that adjective, stem cell, and let's say treatments as opposed to therapies, just interventions. And we set aside the question, is it unapproved, is it unregulated, is it unproved, is it pre-approved, exactly what they are. But what I want to ask you is, if we had to define what is the most important problem that we're trying to solve, or how do you conceptualize the problem? This is a multiple choice question. I'm going to give you some options, and you can either say none of the above, it's a little bit different, or yeah, it's number 4 or number 2 that I'm really trying to solve. I mean, the first is that we're trying to solve the problem of deceptive advertising, exploitative practices that attract desperate patients and families to therapy that is put forward in a predatory, if not fraudulent way. That's the first problem. Second problem is we're trying to strengthen the scientific process of learning and understanding the clinical consequences, effectiveness, and safety of stem cell interventions. That's the second goal we're trying to accomplish. Third option is we're trying to refine or reform or to harmonize regulatory regimes in the United States and in other countries to improve the way stem cell therapy is deployed. Fourth option is we're trying to honor patients' choices. We're trying to respect the autonomy of individual patients as a primary goal of healthcare. And the fifth is we're trying to see to it that safe and effective treatment gets developed as rapidly as possible and delivered to patients. Those are 5 different conceptions, all of which I think have percolated through parts of our conversation. What is it to you that's the problem we should be focused on as we try to look ahead that we're trying to solve here? And Gil, I'm going to start with you because you haven't had a chance to comment as yet in the day.
First off, be careful what you wish for or what you're willing to allow. I guess my short answer would be it's really all of the above. And I realize that's not the answer you were looking for, but let me kind of put it in context. I think that each one of the problems or challenges you described has been discussed during the course of the conversation today. I'm just going to put my arm hat on for a moment and kind of focus on that perspective. As a company in Athersys, obviously, we focus on trying to develop therapies that address serious unmet medical needs. The reason why ARM was founded was because it was recognized that there are multiple different constituencies and different groups that have a stake in what we as a community are actually trying to accomplish in the field of stem cell medicine, cell therapy, regenerative medicine, advanced therapies, whatever you want to call it. And I think the thing that makes ARM different is that ARM was established as an organization that said we want this to be, the founding group actually consisted of leading clinical institutions, groups like CIRM, patient advocacy groups, companies that are trying to develop various therapies, and actually a broad spectrum of different entities that were all committed to identifying the types of issues that you just mentioned and then working together to come up with practical solutions. I would argue, for me, when I had the opportunity to become chairman of the Alliance, one of the things that I was focused on from the outset was trying to change the dynamic of how we deal with the FDA and regulators in general, but specifically the FDA. For too long, the FDA has been, in some areas, depending on how you want to think about it, they were either demonized or criticized and viewed as an obstacle and an impediment to the development of new therapies, such as many of the therapies or options that are being discussed here today. And I think many of us felt like that had to change if we actually wanted to take steps forward to try and improve and accelerate the pace of the development of novel therapies to treat patients like Michael and many others. And so we actually went to the FDA and came with a very different mindset. We said, look, we understand there's undefined territory, there's a lot of challenges and problems that need to be addressed here, but we want to work with you to define precisely what those areas of what the unknowns are, where the biggest hurdles are, and how we can systematically begin to approach those things so that we can advance the field and make these therapies a reality faster. And I guess one final point before I turn it over to somebody else, I believe there's actually a lot of reason for optimism here. In the past couple of years, we've seen the FDA endorse and now is deep into the process of helping create some new regulatory initiatives or frameworks. So the broadened application of the accelerated approval pathway, for example, which if you trace the history back to the 80s, was started directly because of a patient advocacy movement where patients said, we want new therapies to be developed and they've got to be developed faster because people are dying and we've got to do something as fast as possible. So the broadened application of that outside of just where it's historically been applied, I think is a huge step forward. The creation of the new Breakthrough Therapies framework, I think, is another major step forward. And I see similar initiatives. Miyata-san was talking earlier about what's going on in Japan with the creation of a new streamlined approach that is designed to help enable or facilitate innovation and help medicines become a reality faster, not at the expense of patient safety, because neither the FDA or the PMDA or other regulators are going to allow that, but basically doing it in a way where hopefully we can begin to address some of the huge areas of unmet medical need. And frankly, one of the reasons why the regulators and nations are embracing this, it's not just the needs of the individual patients that I think that are at risk here. If you take a bigger picture perspective and actually look at the national healthcare systems and the impact that some of these areas of unmet medical need are having, it's absolutely enormous in economic and human terms. And if we don't start to do something about that, we're going to be paying the price for a very long time. So I'm optimistic, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
Thanks very much, Gil. Glenn, let me turn to you. I mean, if you had to characterize the thing that you think we ought to be keeping foremost in mind as we go forward, how would you express it?
Well, all the above doesn't work for me, but as a clinician, my main focus really has been on patient safety. So the first thing that I want to make sure is that something is safe before it can then be brought to clinical trials to see if it's efficacious. So it's sort of a merger of some of those 5 options you had, but for me, I think patient safety is absolutely number one.
Great. Mike, what would you say?
I think I'd say I'd like to see a more focus on the positive. I mentioned before 66 clinical trials, 2,000 patients. I interpreted the results myself. It'd be great if there was a, let's say, some medical intelligence that was focused on the positive. Instead, when I look at some of the, like for instance this group, I go and I just see all the bad things. I see thalidomide reports and things like that, which is the worst fears. So when I look at like patient handbooks that just say, I just read fear, 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 I said, so what's the truth of these positive things that are happening in this market, and how can you help patients interpret that? And then from that, like in the fertility field, there are regulatory self-imposed, and I liked the comment. You have to be offering something that would make them want to be part of it. But start with sharing a resource of what's really happening, and then maybe offer some certification of these clinics that are doing things right. and help patients identify them. And you know, you can spend more, otherwise I think the patients are going to look at this as a body that's just in their way.
So this point being, your focus would be to try to recognize and certify, celebrate, highlight the ones that are doing well, and not focus primarily on the bad guys. Is that the gist of what you're urging?
I think that the civil tort takes care of malfeasance. You're not going to stop somebody in India from offering, you know, some mixture of, you know, whatever, stem cells from a yucca plant or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think by certifying those that are doing things right, that have good laboratory practice, that have, you know, that are publishing their results in a way that patients can make sense of them, I think that would be very productive.
Thank you, Mike. Maria, let me come over to you. What is the problem domain that you would focus on mainly?
I will also focus on the patient's safety and
Safety.
security, and also on maintaining the best practices and reputations on the stem cell science in Mexico at the same time.
Yeah.
So these are those things are difficult to balance, but I think that we don't need to be charging patients for experimental treatments, but we also should not prohibit stem cell science or foster stem cell science in developing countries.
Yes. Okay, thank you. David, where would you put your focus?
Well, let me start where I wouldn't. I would like to push back on the idea that we need harmonized global standards. I actually think we need diverse but rigorous global standards. I'm a big fan of the FDA. I agree with you, you know, the accelerated approval process that grew out of the AIDS crisis, the priority approvals that the FDA is now focusing on are all good signs with respect to the FDA. But I think harmonization when it comes to the development of new therapies is probably not a good idea. I think that rigor, standards, all important, but a uniform standard may constrain rather than spur the development of new products. With respect to the rest of the wish list, I think that you've got some real overlap. And I think it really boils down to three things. One is to protect patients from snake oil, and that has to be a high priority. And I think at the same time, developing safe, effective treatments based on rigorous science is the other. And I don't think these things are at all incompatible, but that's where I would put my resources.
Thank you. And Tim, you
came to me last.
yes, because you I'm sure you'll have a good overview.
Well, I thought your list was excellent, by the way, because I thought you teased out a lot, and I agree. There's a lot of overlap. So what I'm going to focus on is the efficacy story, because I think that's been underplayed. Absolutely, safety is important, but I believe efficacy is important too. And let's be honest, is George or Irv still here? Yeah, George.
Yes.
No, they're both here.
Irv is here. Yeah, both are here.
You guys can back. The evidence is not great for any of this stuff, and we have to keep saying that over and over again. It may be safe, but the evidence, am I right, Irv?
There's very few pure stem cells.
Use the mic, Irv, or no one will hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Irv. He's more authoritative than I am.
I think about 40 years of bone marrow transplant, bone marrow mobilized blood, there are people alive, many who wouldn't be alive. So that field progressed in a very rigorous way in medical centers. And a very slow way. After the first big leap, then it was a little bit at a time. Now we're moving to pure stem cells, and I find it hard to progress, but the barriers aren't the failure of efficacy of the cells in preclinical trials. There is nobody in big pharma or the venture community who's interested in it. So we have to go to the state, and luckily we have a state that allows us to go there.
Thank you.
So it kind of touches on your first one on the snake oil issue. It's not a homogeneous group. There's a continuum. I think for sure we want to figure out a way that we can crack down on the snake oil, if we can call it that. And that's a big chunk. If you look at the scientific evidence, if you look at the list of what is being offered by these clinics, that is a big chunk. Autism, ALS, we can go down the list, right? There's no evidence to suggest that these therapies are going to be effective. You might as well be offering them homeopathy, right? So I'm trying to be a little bit provocative. But that's a big hunk, and we seem to be shying away from making strong statements about that. And so I would like to see, maybe that was your first one, not to shy away from being aggressive in that category.
Yes. Gil, did you want to add a word now on this, still on this point? Please,
On
go
this
ahead.
point, actually, in response to one of the things Herb mentioned. So I think Tim's hit it right in the head. The reality of it is that there's a lot of data that's been accumulated over the past 10 years and even going back behind that suggests in general, and this doesn't mean every therapy or every approach, because there are certainly some glaring instances where that turned out not to be the case, that the field has established a pretty good safety record. What the field has not yet delivered on, or at least anywhere close to what I think most of us would like to see, is compelling evidence of therapeutic effectiveness, efficacy from properly controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. And I think, to Herb's point, I don't think it's a fair characterization to say that none of the big pharma companies are interested. We have a partnership with Pfizer. They're actually paying for a phase 2 study we're running in treating inflammatory bowel disease patients, and I think the membership among big pharma companies in the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine over the past couple of years has grown substantially. And what I think they're waiting for before they really dive in is they want to see that wave of evidence that shows therapeutic effectiveness from properly controlled, well-constructed studies. When that happens, I think it's going to be much like what we saw with antibodies, where there was a lot of failures for years while we were trying to sort out a bunch of the technical issues. And then once things actually started to progress to the point where we could really harness that technology or what it was capable of, well, look at what we have today. Most of the major, really commercially successful therapeutic products are, in fact, therapeutic antibodies, right? Well, I think the next wave of technology may very well be in the field of cell therapy, and I think that once you begin to see the evidence of that, that's when the big companies really start to put their money where their mouth is.
You know, I keep thinking of myself in the dilemma of a patient, hearing all of us as scientists speculating on the promise of the field, coupled with our determination to prevent those who are now promoting surefire cures from being able to promote their wares. And I think it's a kind of whipsaw that we're putting people in that is very difficult. It's a little bit like the scientist who believes completely in the likelihood of life somewhere in the universe and yet is entirely skeptical of any report of a unidentified flying object because it just can't be here. It's somewhere, but it's not going to arrive on our doorstep. So, you know, somewhere these therapies are going to work, but we don't have them today. But let me ask you the next question to me, which is, what do we not know now that we need to know in order even to take action? David, you, for example, spoke to the fact that we don't know how many people are suffering what degree of harm or what their sentiment is about their experience even, as an example. What else is it that we most need to know at this point to accomplish any of the goals that you were describing that you hold as primary goals? What else do we need to know? Gil, you want to start again?
Yeah, so first off, I thought it was a great question you asked. I would argue that some of the data that was presented here earlier today about the magnitude of the impact, well, some of the numbers that we saw presented today actually lead us in that general direction. Let me give you kind of a back of the envelope estimate. So there was one group, which shall go nameless, that was estimated as having treated 5,000 patients and charging a cost of therapy somewhere between $20,000 up to $80,000 per course of therapy. Okay, well, let's start at kind of the low end. And there was another number, and I forget who gave it, but they said that they accounted for about 70% of the overseas treatments, 70% of the cases of medical tourism, if you will. So if we then say, okay, well, let's take that 5,000 number and we'll increase it by 50%, that gives us up to 7,500 cases, right? We don't know how many people from the U.S. or how many people from any particular country went, but I would argue we could probably make some estimates about that. But 7,500 patients, and if we start with an average cost of, at the low end, say $20,000 per patient, well, that gives us a number, right? $150 million of economic impact. We haven't yet quantified what is the adverse consequences of that. But there's 2 points to make about that. The first is we can't really quantify the adverse consequences of that because those institutions are not obligated and are not voluntarily monitoring the impact of the patients they are treating after they walk out of the clinic. So there's no way to actually do any kind of rigorous assessment on that. So we would just be guessing. I think your point about the fact that people not reporting that many cases might be telling, or it might not, because they may not know that they're supposed to go to you and report that. Okay, so that's one point. But I would argue there's a different type of harm that might be done that we need to understand. And let me try and personalize it using an example. If you have parents of a child that's desperately ill and there's no effective form of treatment here in the United States or in other jurisdictions where they might be inclined to go, and they say, we've got $100,000 that we've saved up for our kids' college education, and we're willing to take a chance and go to this clinic and actually spend a substantial portion of that or even all of it on the prospect of hope for our kids. Is there real economic harm being done? Well, maybe not to the patient that's actually being treated, but I would argue that there's certainly economic harm being done to the family. That is a problem that I think needs to be taken into consideration. It's not clinical risk, but it's real economic harm, okay? But I would also argue that we cannot simply deny or ignore the needs and, frankly, the demands of patients like Michael that are desperate for some form of therapeutic intervention. And I think this is one of the things that actually led to the establishment of the Alliance, was to say, we want to work with the regulators to say, how can we get there faster, but do it in a way that is going to protect patient safety and hopefully align our interests as much as possible without just thinking about it from the perspective of the clinician or the company or frankly, even from the patient. And I think that's the kind of dialogue that we're trying to promote.
Thank you. Anything else that people would say, here's something we really still need to know before we can take more effective action? Maria, what would you say?
Just following what you just have said, like clinics and enterprises need to be voluntary in giving information to regulators in order to share all the information they gather from the patients. But I don't think that they are really, I'm not sure. I mean, in Mexico, we don't have that culture of complaining. So how patients will be complaining? That's another.
It's not usually been our problem in the United States.
I know.
However, I think the fact is they don't know to complain to the FTC. I think that is actually would have been a stretch. If you ask people, you have a problem with a medical treatment overseas, who are you going to write to? I don't know that many, even very educated Americans, would put the FTC on that list. But maybe that's not right,
If they
Dave.
were writing to a state medical board,
Yeah.
or if they were writing to the FDA, or to any other instrumentality of federal government,
You would eventually
we
get
would
to it.
eventually get those complaints.
Okay.
And so I agree with you. Why the FTC?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
a fair point. But still, I mean, narratives move policy,
Yeah.
and there are not that many here. They're just this is not one of those areas where there are lots of stories on one side or the other.
Yeah. Tim, you want to add in on this?
Yeah, it goes to the complaint thing also a little bit, and also to the role of patient groups. So the story and I alluded to it earlier when I was in a question about the liberation treatment, and it's astounding to me that in America this wasn't. Does anyone here know what I mean by the MS liberation treatment? I'm sure you do. Right? This was a massive story, front page stories in Canada. And it was pushed largely by the media and by patient groups. And this is that the MS community wanted access to surgery on the vein in order to open up the vein, and it was promoted as a cure. The MS community was so aggressive that they even passed legislation in Canada to say that these kinds of clinical trials should be funded. Why am I bringing this up? Because all the clinical trials that have gone forward, as predicted by the scientific community, has shown that this is what is the possible mechanism of action? It's clearly not efficacious. Money was spent, etc. No patient complaints, right? There's no patient complaints. And patients were complaining that they didn't have access. It was viewed as a human rights violation. It was viewed as, why should we have to go overseas to get this treatment? Very similar narrative. And Michael, I'm not saying the treatment that you got is in this group. It's a very similar narrative that you're seeing for some stem cell therapy. So it's a very complicated situation for patients to complain in that
Maybe
environment.
one of the difficulties, if the threshold for action by a federal regulatory agency is patient complaint, and if that's too insensitive an indicator of either unsafe or inefficacious treatment, there's a gap there that's a problem. Go ahead. It can be.
It's not just the only patients. These patients have been treated by physicians.
Yes.
Many of the physicians know their patients have gone abroad for treatment. There are other people in this chain who understand what the outcomes are. And so, yes, it may be the patient, for all the reasons that Tim is talking about, may not self-report, but where are the physicians? Where are the people who were involved in the care and treatment of this patient before desperation set in and they were forced to go elsewhere? I mean, there are other mechanisms that don't seem to be activated here.
Let me move us to a question of what do we want to do next? Michael, you actually started us off on this because you had a very specific suggestion. You said, focus on the positive. Let's work on getting records of where there is at least high standards of technical safety involved in clinical settings or other things. I don't want to put more words in your mouth, but is that what you would focus on as the next step? And I'd love to get everyone's reaction to where would you go next? What would you want to see done?
Absolutely. I'd focus on things that are working. You know, patients don't know. There have been, you know, I've heard the efficacy has improved. Well, I saw 66 trials on by just taking expanded mesenchymal stem cell search, cultured cells, and a couple of others, and a number of those studies showed results that somebody who has MS looks at it and say, wait a second, their measurement was optic nerve, and there was an increased, their measurement was EDS scores, and they changed, they went up. So where is the body that's taking all that information and helping patients? Instead, it seems like what's being discussed is how do we're focusing on the malfeasance or the few problems instead of, and then patients are going to look at somebody who's doing that, it's just focusing on the negative things that are out there as an impediment. So I'd say the most productive thing that could be done is help patients sort through the clinical trials that have showed efficacy. Describe what those are and what they, you know, and then I think the next step would be doing what was described for the fertility market, where you offer some sort of certification and make it simple. You start slowly, and or you know, and get. Then you can offer that to patients. These are the ones that are certified that they're using proper lab, you know, they're properly lab regulated and so forth, and help patients that way. And I think you'll be on a much different path.
This may be a good bridge right over to you, Glenn, because when your comments from the perspective and experience of assisted reproductive technology emphasized how important it was for there to be a stake in the outcome for the professional regulation to have any bite in the experience of clinics and patients. But what, from your experience or what you've heard in the course of this day, what would you put forward as the most important area to focus on right now as the next step in this domain of regenerative medicine?
Just based on our work in the fertility field, I think certification or some type of minimum standards would certainly help quite a bit. And I've seen there's a lot of different groups here, a lot of different interests, but getting everyone, so the American Fertility Society, or ASRM, and there's a European society, there's other societies, but if you look at their guidelines, they base their guidelines off of each other. So our guidelines, the European, ESHRE, the European Society, pretty much bases their guidelines off of our guidelines, and we work together. I would love to see, if possible, some sort of minimum standards or certification or some type of accreditation of laboratories that are doing this, so that, yes, they're in China, but there's an organization like CAP that goes to other places and looks at the laboratory, looks at the techniques. Are they safe? Are they clean? Are they effective? And at least there's a minimum standard that you can at least say, yes, this is a CAP certified or a certain certified laboratory, and then require outcomes data to be submitted to a central organization, which is not punitive, but just, you know, looking at outcomes.
So looking at the qualifications of the clinical center lab as distinct from only looking at a case-by-case intervention outcome on a particular condition. So looking at both of those in a way that you were describing, very interesting. Gil, where would you focus that's not now being done? What would be your next step?
Well, I think we're long overdue for the development of a coherent national strategy and a national initiative. In fact, I'd like it to be an international initiative. I think there's some very exciting things going on outside the United States, whether it's in countries like the UK or Japan or other parts of the world. I'd actually like to see us work together along the lines of something like the Human Genome Project was, where we are marshaling common areas of expertise and resource pools to be able to try and really drive the development of this field forward so that we can get to definitive demonstrations or not of how these therapies can actually make a difference in areas of significant unmet medical need.
Do you think you could articulate a concrete enough set of goals that would drive and mobilize that kind of an effort?
Yeah, well, we've done that. We were
Okay.
invited to do that by some people here in Washington over at OSTP, and in fact, it was one of the projects that we worked on this summer, the leadership team from the Alliance, and we actually put together a multifaceted plan that says, these are the areas that we think are the biggest obstacles that are holding the field back, and this is how we would actually propose to attack each and every one of those things. And I think part of that requires a lot of political will to be able to actually drive that to the point where you've got where you can make it happen. The good news is that there's a lot of bipartisan recognition that there is a big problem. There's a big problem in the big picture sense that our national healthcare infrastructure is threatened in a lot of different ways, and it's only going to get worse over the next 20 years with the aging of this unprecedented demographic that we're all experiencing. I mean, we're going to see, most people don't realize it, we're going to see an 80% increase in the number of people over the age of 65, and that drives an enormous part of the economic burden that is going to be felt through Medicare and outside of Medicare and other elements of healthcare. So I think that if we could, using that as a blueprint, and it may contain most of the right things, maybe there's things that should be on the list as opposed to what we drafted, but I think the time has come for us to have a national dialogue about making a strategic investment in this area, and if we do that, to really rigorously assess, hey, here's what the payoff might be, because I can tell you, we've done that math, the payoff could be absolutely enormous.
Thanks, Gil. Tim, where would you put your emphasis for the next phase?
Michael's idea about patient information, but it's a real challenge. What you'd want is a patient information site that was truly independent. I'm a Cochrane collaboration groupie. I love that kind of approach, right? Where you have this independent assessment of the state of the science. You have that done, and you could do it for major diseases, right? So you could have what's the state of the science. But as part of that, you'd also have to have information for the public about the nature of clinical trials. Now, as everyone in this room knows, they almost never pan out. Like, that sounds like a bold statement, but it's true. And they're almost never replicated. I think Irv talked about the replication rate from the best journals was 30%. And the replication rate for...
That's only the first effort to replicate.
Yeah, it's right. I mean, the replication rates are grim. The replication rates for candidate genes, do you know what that was for the Human Genome Project? Do you know what it is? 1.25%, right? So these are great studies and great journals. So that has to be part of the story, and it's very difficult to communicate that. A colleague of mine, Zubin Master, thinks that this should be a big part of the story. So I think that would be very, very valuable to have that, some kind of independent, I don't know if the ISSCR could do it, but as was noted, they also could be perceived of having a vested interest in the field, right? So I'd also like to see the professional organizations. I agree with you. I think that the clinicians that are involved when they're seeing these patients can play an important role both at the beginning, when patients are coming in asking about these clinics. In Canada, family physicians can play a big role. And in other countries that have family physicians, no. That was supposed to be a little dig on the United States. Sorry, guys.
We're such an easy target. Exactly. I mean, really.
You've heard it too many times. And I'm also why I was going at you is because I'm also very interested in this truth in advertising angle. I think this is a fascinating angle that deserves some more exploration. I think that we could get at how this is represented to the world. So those are kind of three simple steps. Of course, I think we need to do more than that, but I think that would be a good place to start.
Great, Tim. David, something you would set forward and say, look, whatever else you do, here's a priority you ought to keep in mind.
I think part of the reason why consumers may gravitate to these kinds of unproven therapies is because they're getting a mixed message from the scientific community. On one hand, stem cells have been touted in the press as the next breakthrough therapy. On the other hand, you're telling them they don't work. That's a hard message for most consumers to digest. And so I agree with most of my colleagues here that you need to have straight talk with consumers, but it's very difficult when you're sending a completely mixed message. And I think that, and I understand why, but and this really also, I think, goes back down to treating physicians. I mean, most of the people who I assume go abroad for these treatments have at least had some conversation with their doctor about whether there are alternative therapies available to them outside the U.S. borders. And I really wonder what sort of message they're getting from their physicians as well. These are not decisions made lightly. As Gil pointed out, just the economic cost is often enormous. So I really wonder the kind of information consumers are getting, what sort of screens it goes through, and I think collectively we need to do a better job making sure people understand what they're doing.
Thank you very much. And Maria.
I think that for me, from Mexico, I think that you should invite more Mexican policymakers to this kind of discussions and get them involved in what is going on in the scientific field, and also what is going on in the regulation in other areas, in order to get some kind of harmonization of minimal principle-based approach to the area, since this is very complex. We don't really know what is going on. So if we really need to move forward in the scientific field and also assure the security of patients, you should invite more people from developing countries who are in the field.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've enjoyed a remarkable focus and coherent set of observations. I won't say we've come down to a single thematic point of agreement, but I do think we've illuminated a number of very critical opportunities and needs in this field. And please join me in thanking our panel.